certainly has been very convicting for me. And that the main thrust of this passage, if you think about the meaning of the whole passage as a circle, the dot at the center of that circle is the imperative that we follow Jesus' example of laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters in costly, sacrificial, practical deeds of love. So, heavy on the imperative tonight. It doesn't mean that I think that works are what save us. The thing that justifies us before God is grace through faith alone. So don't hear me saying that if we love our brothers and sisters in sacrificial ways, that will merit or earn salvation for us. But the same grace that justifies us also sanctifies us. And the Bible is full of commandments and things that we are supposed to actually strive to do. It tells us that we should strive to be pleasing to God. And that should be part of what we preach, as well as preaching the grace of justification. So with that said, I'm going to read 1 John 3, 16 through 18. And here's what it says. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. So the outline for tonight is very simple. It comes straight from the text, and there's just two parts. The first part is how do we know God's love? And the second part is how must we show God's love? It comes right from the text, the very first part of it. I'm saying, how do we know God's love? Well, look at what it says. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. So the first part of that outline, how do we know God's love, is going to be pretty short. The bulk of what I have to say is that second part, how must we show God's love? The first part, how do we know God's love? It says that he laid down his life for us. And one of the things that struck me as curious about this is it says he, but it doesn't tell us who that he is. And if you look back, the previous verse doesn't mention Jesus, and the verse before doesn't mention Jesus, nor the verse before. I think you have to go back about 8 verses, and it mentions the Son of God. But nowhere does it say who the referent is for that he. And that just goes to show how steeped in the cross event, the atonement of Jesus, the sacrificial Lamb of God, the early church was. If John says something about the person who laid his life down, everybody knows. It's talking about Jesus. So Jesus is the one that it's talking about, even though his name is not in the verse. And you might ask, how did he lay down his life for us? And all of us, I think, immediately would go to thinking about the cross, which is the supreme example of him laying down his life for us. At the cross, he actually bled out and died for us. And that is true, that is how we see him laying down his life for us in the extreme. But we should also remember that his entire life on this earth, his incarnation, from the time he was born in Bethlehem through to the time where he died on the cross, was his humiliation, that he humbled himself by taking the form of a man. He had to eat, he had to sleep, he suffered pain, and everything that he suffered and all the humiliations he bore through his whole life, that's included in what it means that he laid down his life for us. I also want to point out the contrast between Jesus in verse 16 and Cain in the previous verses. Cain, you heard about last Sunday evening, I believe. The passage right before this uses Cain as a negative example and says explicitly, do not be like Cain. This passage implicitly says, do be like Jesus. So the text we're looking at right now says, be like Jesus, follow his example, imitate him. And it's striking just how much of a contrast there is between Cain and Jesus. Cain is a son of the devil. His father is the devil. And Jesus is the Son of God. Cain has a brother, and he hates him and kills him. Jesus has brothers and sisters, and instead of hating and killing them, he loves them and gives his life for them. And Cain, who's evil, deserves to die, but instead puts the righteous to death. Jesus, who's righteous, doesn't deserve to die, but he does receive death himself so that those, his brothers and sisters, can be free. And so when we ask the question, how do we know the love of God? We look at the entire life of Jesus, his humiliation, and ultimately his death on the cross for us. We also can contrast him with what the world is like, those who follow the devil. And Cain is a quintessential example of that. So that is the first part of the outline for this evening, how we know God's love. We see it in Jesus. The other part is how must we show God's love? And this part does have like 5 or 6 subpoints. So you'll have to hang with me. I'm going to say them now for those of you who want to know where we're headed. And then we'll go back and look at them in more detail. How must we show God's love? The first point is going to be we must, which just means it's not optional. It's something that we have to do. The second is we must follow Jesus in the way of the cross. The third is we must acknowledge that we are people who have the world's goods. The next is we must resist the fleshly inclination to close our hearts when we see those in need. The fifth is we must do practical deeds to back up our pious talk. And the final is we need to rely on the abiding gifts of God in us. So that's where we're headed, unpacking how it is that we must show the love of God. The first one is we must. We must show it. It's not optional. And I get that from, in verse 16, it says we ought to do something. So this is telling us what we must do. We ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. And in verse 18, where we have another imperative, it says, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. So we're told explicitly in 16 and 18 that this is something that we ought to do, that we must do. I also want to point out verse 17, sandwiched between those two, is a very serious verse because it gives an example of a person who has the world's goods and sees a brother in need and closes his heart against that brother and doesn't help him. And it asks a rhetorical question that's very convicting. It says, how does God's love abide in that person? And the answer is rhetorically, it doesn't. So if you look at your life and you see that you have a habit of closing your heart against Christian brothers and sisters in need, that actually means you need to examine yourself. That means I need to examine myself to see if I'm in the faith. Because this says God's love doesn't abide in you if you close your heart against a Christian brother or sister in need. So we must not be people who close our hearts against the needs of our brothers and sisters. And we ought to be people who lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters. I will say that the next line, it says that we must lay down our lives, is obviously paralleling the first line that says Jesus did it. He laid down his life. So it's showing that we are to use him as an example. We are to imitate him. And it says we need to do that for the brothers. And I want to ask the question, who are the brothers? It includes sisters too, all right? So the brothers and sisters. And it is specifically talking about the household of God. Earlier in chapter 3, we're told that we've been made children of God. There's a strong familial quality to the whole chapter. There's the brothers, there's the father, there's the son. And it's speaking about the Christians in the church. Does that mean that we don't have to love the world out there? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean there's a priority to loving Christian brothers and sisters. And we can back that up by looking at Galatians 6. It says, do good to all, especially to those in the household of faith. So you see that it's good to do good to all, but there's a special relationship within the household of God. So this is specifically talking about seeing a Christian brother or sister in need and closing our hearts against them. It's also an Old Testament principle too. If in the Old Testament, the people of God had special rules for how they had to treat each other that were different from how they treated the foreigners or the outside world. And what does it mean to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters? There's two passages that come to my mind that really illustrate that well. One is Mark 8, and Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will find it. So Jesus says if we want to follow him in the way of the cross, we have to take up a cross, deny ourselves, and lose our lives. And those are hard words. And it's hard to put into practice, but that is what, by the Spirit, by God's power, we are moving towards. What we're shooting for is denial of ourselves and total submission and surrender to the will of God. Another passage is Philippians 2. It says, with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this attitude in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So if we want to see what it looks like to lay our lives down for the brothers and the sisters, we can meditate on those two passages, Mark 8 and Philippians 2, and that will help us to see what it is that we are called to imitate. The third point was that we must acknowledge that we are those who have the world's goods. And this comes from the text. It says in verse 17 probably, it says, if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So, are we people who have the world's goods? If we're not, maybe we can just not have to worry about this, and it doesn't really apply to us. I want to say that we are, here in America, people who have the world's goods. If you compare the amount of things, material possessions that we have to the rest of the world and the rest of human history, we're probably in the 99th percentile of having the world's goods. One of the commentators I looked at, I. Howard Marshall, he said, if you have the means of livelihood in the world, and everybody who can afford to buy this book comes into that category, and you see a brother in want and show no pity to him, then the love of God cannot possibly be in you. The tragedy is that we have not learned to take this seriously. So he says, if you can afford to buy my commentary, you're one of the people who has the world's goods. So that's important to realize. We have to realize that even if we don't have as much as our neighbor, or even if we would consider ourselves just middle class, that we are people who have a lot in terms of worldly goods. Another guy, Robert Yarborough, commented, he said, in an email, internet, and global age, the number of believers in proximity lends even more sting to John's barb than it carried in the first century. We definitely can see need not only in our own congregation or in poorer churches around us, but we now, with the globalization of things, can know about need all around the world. So we are people who have the world's goods, and we are people who see Christians in need. This text, in short, applies to us. We must, fourthly, resist the fleshly inclination to close our hearts when we see need. And I wanted to point out two things about this. It says our hearts, but the word for that, that's translated hearts, is actually one that means intestines. And what it means is that there should be a visceral reaction. We should have feelings. We should have emotions when we see a Christian brother or sister who is in need. And I will confess that I'm lacking often in emotions and in right feelings. And one of the things that I love is that Jesus came, the promise of the new covenant is that that God will take our heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. And he will take the hard-heartedness that we have and the lack of the right emotions and the lack of right feelings towards our brothers and sisters, and he will make them right. So we can actually pray to God to ask him to not only help us to do right things, but to help us to feel right things. We should do that. I need to do that. Also, there's an important parallel back in Deuteronomy 15 about the idea of closing our hearts when we see a brother in need. Deuteronomy 15 is talking about the year of Jubilee, and God commanded the people of Israel every 7th year to release whatever it is that they loaned to someone that hadn't been paid back yet, and they didn't get it back. And it says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, there's that idea, or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. It says, take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and say, the 7th year of release is near, and you look grudgingly with your eye and give him nothing. So the idea there is, imagine that the 7th year was going to happen next week, and a poor brother needs something, and you're going to loan it to him. But a week from now, if he hasn't given it back to you, it's gone. You don't get it back. You release that. And it's saying that people were tempted to not be generous as they got closer to the year of Jubilee. And they say, no, don't have a grudging eye, don't have a tight hand, don't have a hard heart, but give to your brother in need. So this is not a new principle. This is something that God called people in Deuteronomy to do as well. And he says that we need to do the same. Don't close the heart, but have an open heart when a brother or sister has need. And it doesn't say anything about the person deserving your charity. It can be a person who's gotten themselves into trouble from poor choices, but we're still called to help our Christian brothers and sisters in need. Jesus says similar things in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, and when you lend to someone, lend expecting nothing in return. And he says, when you throw a party, invite the lame and the poor, because they can't pay you back. And sell your possessions and give to the poor. So Jesus also reiterates this in his teaching, and now here John is calling us to do the same. Fifthly, we must do practical deeds to back up our pious talk. That's a major point of the last verse. It says, brothers, children, let us not love in word and talk, but in deed and truth. That means that we can stand up here and talk about how much we love people all day long, but if we're not putting that into practical action, meeting people's needs, doing loving deeds, then that's just empty talk. And James says almost an identical thing in chapter 2. He says this, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. So there's a tremendous parallel between these two passages. They're almost identical. Both of them speak of a brother or sister in need. Both of them speak of somebody who says something with their mouth but doesn't actually help. Both of them have rhetorical questions that the answer to is, this person's faith isn't real. This person's love isn't real. This person may be a false professor who just says they're a Christian, but they're not. They maybe haven't actually been born of God. So both passages say about the same thing, and it's very important to see that our deeds have to back up our words. And Jesus said this all the time. He said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say? He told a parable about two brothers. One brother, the father says, hey, will you go out in the field and do this? And he goes, yeah, I'll do it, but he doesn't do it. The other one says, no, I won't do it, but he does do it. And Jesus says, which of them did what his father wanted? He said, the one who actually went out and did it. So it's a very important principle. James also says, let's not be just hearers of the word, let's be doers of it. Huge principle that we need to actually back up our profession with our deeds. And finally, you might ask, well, Where do we get the strength for this? Where do we get the power for this? How are we able to do this? Because this is calling us to lay down our lives, maybe up to the point of death, for our Christian brothers and sisters. And even not to the point of death. How hard is it to lend and not get anything back? To invite people to parties and you're never going to get reciprocated? To sell your possessions and give to the poor? That's hard. It's very hard. How are we going to do this? There's 3 abiding gifts in chapter 3 of 1 John. One is God's seed abides in us. That's verse 9. One is God's love abides in us. That's verse implied in verse 17. And the final in verse 24 is God's Spirit abides in us. These abiding gifts of God will give us what we need to actually put this into practice. When God's seed abides in us, it means that we're no longer children of the devil, but we're children of God. And we bear a family resemblance to our father and brother. We've been changed from a good tree, or a bad tree into a good tree, and we'll bear good fruit. So we have the seed of God in us to give us strength for this and to change us. We also have God's love that actually can flow through us. It's not our own love, it's God's love, and we're a channel of his love to others. And we have the Spirit who abides in us and gives us the power to put to death the deeds of the flesh. So in summary, we've seen that we know God's love by looking at Christ's humiliation through his life and his death on the cross for us. We show God's love by realizing that we have the world's goods, by opening our eyes to see brothers and sisters in need, by not closing our hearts but praying for right emotions, and actually putting into action the things that we say with our mouth. And we get the power for all of that from knowing that God has made us new, that we have his seed abiding in us, that we have his love abiding in us, and that we have his Spirit abiding in us. I thought at the end here, we've come to the conclusion that it would be good to give some specific ideas, to just get our brainstorm going of how can we actually apply this. If I said that the whole point of this is imperative and we're supposed to do something, I thought maybe I should start thinking about what I could do. So I've come up with ideas. I'm going to share them with you in closing. If you want to write things down, you can. If not, this may be recorded. If it is, you can listen to this part sometime during the week. But here's some thoughts. Let's spend time reflecting on Christ's humiliation and sacrificial love using passages like Philippians 2. Ask God to help us see how comparatively rich we are in material goods and look for ways to reduce our standard of living. Actively look for opportunities to see those in need. It says in here, if you see a brother who has need, well, one way to avoid that is just not to look very hard. But let's actually pray that God will show us people who have need in our congregation, Christians in our community and around the world, and perhaps setting an actual goal and a deadline, maybe in the next month, to start showing that we take Jesus seriously in the things he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe actually find some possessions that are actually valuable to you and sell them and give it, the money from that, to the poor, Christians around us or around the world. If you have 2 tunics, give one away. I don't think many of us have tunics, but what if you have 2 houses? Maybe consider selling one. 2 cars. Maybe look for someone in the congregation whose car is on its last leg and give it to them. We actually, my wife Elena and I, had a friend when we came back from doing some missionary work in China for a few years. We didn't have a car. We didn't have money. She didn't have 2 cars. She had 1. Guess what she did? She gave us her car. She used public transportation. That was costly. It was a great gift to us. We'll never forget it. Do you have a field or property? Maybe consider selling it and laying the proceeds at the feet of the elders and deacons. Have you been building bigger barns to store up abundance so that you can eat, drink, and be merry in your retirement? Consider reducing your 401k contributions so that you can be rich towards God now. Do you have very little? Reflect on the widow's mite. Do you have a lot? Reflect on Zacchaeus, who gave away half of his wealth to the poor. These are some thoughts to get things going. But if we The commentator said that the tragedy is that we haven't yet learned to take this stuff seriously. If we Christians in the United States, me included, would take this more seriously, it might be more like the early church, where there wasn't anyone needy among the brothers and sisters. So, with that, I will say, if you feel convicted by this like I do, repent and believe the gospel. There is forgiveness. If God would mark our iniquities, who could stand? But with him there is forgiveness, that he may be feared. I'm going to close with a truth that's straight from the text. Those who truly know the costly love of Jesus will truly show the costly love of Jesus. Brothers and sisters, let us follow the example of our Lord and get to work.